I was erased from my son's life like I never existed. No calls, no explanations, not even on birthdays or holidays. For 5 years, I lived like a ghost while they built a life without me. Then one day, my face appeared on a magazine cover, and suddenly, they remembered I was family. That night, they invited me to dinner like nothing had ever happened. But what they did not know was this: I was no longer the woman they abandoned, and I did not come back for reconciliation. I came back with the truth. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Collins. I am 72 years old, and I live alone in a small wooden house in Charleston, South Carolina. The house sits on a quiet street lined with oak trees that have stood longer than most people I know. It used to feel alive, filled with movement, laughter, and the ordinary noise of a family that believed it would always stay together. Now, it feels like a place that remembers more than it holds. I was a high school literature teacher for over 30 years. I spent my life teaching other people's children how to understand stories, how to read between the lines, how to recognize truth, even when it was hidden. I believe those lessons applied to my own life as well. I believe that family, like a good story, had structure, meaning, and loyalty at its core. I believe that if you gave enough love, it would return to you in time. After my husband, Thomas Collins, passed away, everything shifted in ways I did not immediately recognize. Thomas had been the steady center of our family. He was quiet, but strong, the kind of man who did not need to raise his voice to be heard. When he was gone, the silence he left behind did not just fill the rooms. It settled into people. My son Eric had always been close to me. As a child, he would sit at the kitchen table while I graded papers, asking questions about everything from school to life. He trusted me. He listened. Even as an adult, he used to call me just to check in, just to hear my voice. That changed slowly after he married Samantha. Samantha was the kind of woman people admire at first glance. She was polished, confident, always dressed as if she were stepping into a photograph. She spoke kindly, but there was always something measured behind her words, something that felt calculated rather than natural. I noticed it early, but I told myself I was being unfair. I wanted to believe she loved my son the way he deserved. The changes did not happen all at once. They came in small, almost invisible ways. Fewer phone calls, shorter visits, holidays that became uncertain instead of planned. I would hear about family decisions after they had already been made. At first, I excused it. People grow. Lives become busy. I repeated that to myself often enough that I almost believed it. But the silence began to stretch in ways that could not be explained by busyness. There were evenings when I would set out 2 cups for coffee without thinking, only to realize there was no one coming. The clock in the living room grew louder, marking time in a house that no longer needed to keep it. I started noticing how still everything had become. When I did see Eric and Samantha, something felt different. Conversation stayed on the surface. Eye contact was brief. There was a politeness that replaced warmth, like speaking to someone you know, but no longer understand. Samantha would smile, but her eyes never quite followed. Eric seemed tired, distracted, as if he were balancing something he could not explain. I began to sense that I was no longer part of their world in the way I once was. It was not something anyone said directly. It was something you felt in the pauses, in the things left unsaid, in the way decisions moved forward without you. I found myself sitting at the edges of conversations that used to include me fully. Looking back, I understand that nothing truly breaks all at once. It wears down slowly, like wood under constant pressure. You do not notice the damage until one day you realize the structure is no longer the same. That was what happened to my family. Not a single moment, but a series of small shifts that led to something I could not yet name, but could already feel. If you're still watching and starting to feel the quiet tension building beneath the surface, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to what really started breaking everything apart. 5 years passed without a single word from my son. Time did not move in a straight line during those years. It stretched, folded, and blurred until I could no longer separate one month from another. There were no milestones, no moments of closure, just a quiet continuation of absence. Losing someone who is still alive creates a strange kind of grief. It does not end. It lingers in the background, shaping your days without ever fully revealing itself. In the beginning, I waited. I kept my phone within reach at all times, convinced that at any moment it might ring. I would glance at the screen whenever it lit up, my heart reacting before my mind could catch up. Each notification carried a small, fragile hope that it might be Eric. It never was. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Eventually, the waiting became a habit rather than a belief. I was no longer expecting anything, but I had not yet learned how to stop. There came a point when I understood that waiting was holding me in place. It was not preserving the relationship I had lost. It was keeping me tied to something that no longer existed. That realization did not come with relief. It came with a quiet acceptance that if my life was going to continue, it would have to do so without them. I remembered then the piece of land my husband had once mentioned, located in Sedona, Arizona. It had never seemed important before. It was simply something we owned, something distant and unused. But in that moment, it felt like the only direction I had left. I packed what I needed and left Charleston behind, not because I was ready, but because I could not remain where everything reminded me of what I had lost. Sedona was unlike anything I had known. The red rocks rose against the sky with a kind of quiet strength that made everything else feel smaller. The air felt open, as if it carried possibility instead of memory. For the first time in years, I was not surrounded by echoes of my past. I was standing in a place that did not expect anything from me. I began with very little. The idea of creating a retreat came slowly, shaped by the women I met there. Many of them were like me, older, overlooked, carrying stories that no one had taken the time to hear. We started small, working with what we had, building something that was not defined by age but by experience. It was not easy. There were days when I questioned whether I had made a mistake, when the weight of uncertainty pressed heavily on me. But there was also a sense of purpose that I had not felt in a long time. The retreat grew in ways I had not anticipated. Visitors came, then returned, then told others. What began as an idea became a business, and then something more than that. It became proof that I could still create, still build, still matter. I was no longer waiting for a place in someone else's life. I was making space for my own. The magazine feature came unexpectedly. A journalist visited, asked questions, and left without any promise of what might follow. When I saw the issue, my face on the cover, I felt a quiet stillness rather than excitement. The article spoke of success, of transformation, of value. It reduced years of struggle into a few paragraphs, but it was enough to be seen. That night, I sat alone, the magazine resting on the table. I did not feel the need to celebrate. I felt steady, grounded in something that no longer depended on anyone else. Then my phone vibrated. The message was from Samantha. The words were simple, almost casual, as if no time had passed at all. She wrote that they missed me, that they wanted to reconnect, that there would be a family dinner that night. I read the message more than once. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the years that had disappeared, only an invitation, as if everything between us could be ignored. I set the phone down and looked out into the darkness beyond the window. The woman I had been 5 years ago would have felt hope in that moment. She would have responded immediately, grateful for the chance to return. But that woman no longer existed. What I felt instead was clarity. If you're still watching and you can sense that something deeper is about to unfold, comment number 2 below so I know you're paying attention. Now let's go back to the moment everything changed. I remember the exact night everything broke, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because of how controlled it felt. It was a Thursday evening in early spring, the kind where the air is still cool but carries the promise of warmth. I had just finished cleaning the kitchen when Eric and Samantha arrived. They did not call ahead, which was unusual, but I welcomed them in without question. At that time, I still believed that unexpected visits meant something good. From the moment they stepped inside, I sensed something was different. Eric did not hug me the way he usually did. His movements felt restrained, as if he were following a script he had rehearsed. Samantha walked in with her usual composure, but there was a sharpness in her posture, a kind of readiness that did not belong in a casual family visit. We sat in the living room, and for a brief moment, there was silence that felt heavier than it should have. Samantha was the one who began speaking. She introduced the idea quickly, without hesitation, explaining that they wanted to sell the beachfront inn that had belonged to my husband's family for generations. She spoke about opportunity, about timing, about how the market was at its peak. Her words were smooth, carefully structured, as if she had already anticipated every possible objection. It was not a discussion. It was a presentation. I listened without interrupting, trying to understand the full scope of what she was proposing. The numbers sounded impressive, but something beneath them did not feel right. The investment she described lacked clarity, and the people involved were unfamiliar to me. There was a sense of urgency in her tone that made me uneasy. Important decisions should not feel rushed, especially when they involve something that carries history. When she finished, I took a moment before responding. I told them that I did not think it was the right decision. I explained that the inn was more than a financial asset. It was part of our family's story, something that could not be replaced once it was gone. My voice remained calm, but my answer was firm. The change in Samantha was immediate. The warmth in her expression disappeared, replaced by something colder. She accused me of holding on to the past, of refusing to adapt, of controlling decisions that were no longer mine to make. Her words were precise, each one placed with intention. It was not anger, it was strategy. I turned to Eric, expecting him to respond, to balance the conversation in some way. For a moment, he hesitated. I could see the conflict in his face, the part of him that still recognized me as his mother. But that moment passed quickly. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but the meaning was unmistakable. He said they needed space, that their life had to be their own, that they could not keep adjusting around me. The room seemed to shift in that moment. It was no longer a conversation about property or investment. It was something deeper, something final. I realized that what they were asking for was not agreement. They were asking for distance, and not the kind that could be measured in time. The tension continued to build, but there was nothing left to argue. every word only confirmed what had already been decided before they arrived. I asked how long this distance would last, not because I expected a clear answer, but because I needed to hear how they defined it. Eric did not look at me when he responded. He said it would last as long as necessary. They left shortly after that. I stood by the window as their car pulled away, watching the red glow of the taillights disappear down the street. For a moment, I thought about calling out, about stopping them, about saying something that might change the direction of what was happening, but I did not move. The next day, I tried calling Eric. The call did not go through. I sent a message, and it was never answered. I went to their house later that week and stood on the front porch, certain that someone was inside. The curtains shifted slightly, then became still again. The door remained closed. That was when I understood that this was not temporary. It was not a misunderstanding that would resolve itself with time. It was a decision that had already been made, carried out with quiet precision. I was not being pushed away. I had been removed. If you're still watching and you felt that turning point hit harder than expected, comment number 3 below to stay with me. Now, let's see what happened after the silence took over. The days that followed their departure did not collapse all at once. They stretched, thin and quiet, each one carrying the same unanswered questions. I called Eric the next morning, expecting nothing and still hoping for something. The call did not go through. I tried again later that afternoon, then again that evening. Each time the same result. I told myself it might be temporary, that perhaps he needed time to cool down, that silence did not always mean finality. I sent a message the next day. It was simple, careful, without accusation. I asked if he was all right. I said I was here whenever he was ready to talk. The message remained unanswered. Days passed, and the small gray indication on my phone never changed. It stayed there, quiet and unmoving, as if even the possibility of response had been removed. A week later, I drove to his house. The neighborhood looked the same, neat lawns and familiar streets, but it felt different standing there alone. I walked up to the front door and knocked, once, then again. There was no response. I stood there longer than I should have, listening to the silence. Then I noticed the curtain shift slightly, just enough to confirm what I already suspected. Someone was inside. They chose not to open the door. That moment settled something in me that words could not. It was not uncertainty anymore. It was intention. The months that followed were marked by absence, but also by repetition. I continued to reach out in small ways at first, sending occasional messages, calling less frequently, but still calling. Each attempt was met with the same result. Eventually, the effort itself began to feel like something misplaced, as if I were speaking into a space that no longer connected to anything real. Time moved forward, carrying with it the calendar of a life I was no longer part of. My birthday came and went quietly. I bought a small cake out of habit, placed it on the table, and sat across from it without lighting the candles. It felt unnecessary. Christmas arrived with its familiar rituals. I put up decorations, arranged the house the way I always had, but the effort felt hollow. The lights reflected off empty spaces, and the silence that followed was deeper than before. Mother's Day was the hardest. The world outside seemed filled with reminders of something I no longer had. Flowers appeared on every corner, restaurants filled with the family celebrating together. I stayed inside that day, not out of bitterness, but because I did not know where I belonged in that moment. It was easier to remain still than to step into something that no longer included me. The house began to change as I changed within it. I stopped cleaning as often. Some rooms remained untouched for weeks. The routines that once structured my days faded into something less defined. There were mornings when getting out of bed felt unnecessary, when time seemed to pass, whether I participated in it or not. Then one morning, I woke before sunrise from a dream I could not fully remember, only the feeling it left behind. I sat in the kitchen, the light barely reaching through the windows, and realized that I had been living in a state of waiting that no longer made sense. Nothing was coming back. No explanation, no reconciliation, no sudden return. What I had lost was not being held somewhere for me. It was gone. That realization did not bring relief. It brought clarity. I thought about the land in Sedona, something my husband had once mentioned in passing, something I had never considered important. Now it felt like the only direction that was not tied to what I had lost. I did not have a detailed plan. I did not know what I would build or how I would begin. But I knew I could not remain where I was, surrounded by a life that no longer included me. Leaving Charleston was not dramatic. There were no final goodbyes, no sense of closure. I packed what I needed, closed the door behind me, and drove toward something uncertain. Sedona greeted me with a landscape that felt vast and unfamiliar, but also strangely open. It did not carry my past. It did not remind me of what had been taken. I started with small steps. The idea of creating a retreat came slowly, shaped by the people I met and the stories I heard. It was not easy. There were days when I questioned everything, when the weight of starting over felt heavier than anything I had experienced before. But there was also a quiet determination that grew stronger with each decision I made. The work gave structure to my days again. It demanded attention, effort, and persistence. Slowly, something began to take shape. It was not just a place, it was a beginning. For the first time in a long time, I was no longer waiting. If you're still watching and you're wondering how someone rebuilds from that kind of loss, comment number 4 below to keep going. Now, let's step into the moment they came back. I arrived in Charlotte just before sunset, the sky fading into a pale gray that matched the quiet tension I carried with me. The building where Eric and Samantha lived rose sharply above the street, all glass and steel, the kind of place that made a statement before you even stepped inside. It was not just a home, it was a declaration of status. When the door opened, Samantha greeted me with a warmth that felt carefully rehearsed. Her smile was wide, her voice light, her movements precise. Nothing about it felt spontaneous. Eric stood just behind her, his posture slightly rigid, as if he had not decided how he was supposed to act. He hugged me briefly, then stepped back too quickly, avoiding my eyes. The apartment was immaculate. Everything was arranged with intention, every surface polished, every object placed to be seen. I recognized the kind of furniture that belonged in magazines, not in the daily lives of people with ordinary incomes. It was too much, too perfect, and beneath that perfection, something felt unstable. The children were in the living room. They looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and hesitation, as if trying to place me in a memory that no longer felt clear. I smiled at them, but the distance between us was undeniable. Time had done what silence always does. It had replaced familiarity with uncertainty. Dinner began with polite conversation. Samantha spoke easily, guiding the discussion through the safe topics, avoiding anything that carried weight. Eric contributed when necessary, but his voice lacked conviction. I listened more than I spoke, allowing the rhythm of the evening to unfold without interference. It did not take long for the shift to happen. Samantha mentioned the article, her tone filled with admiration that felt just slightly exaggerated. She spoke about the retreat, about its success, about how impressive it was to build something so valuable at my age. The words were flattering, but they carried a direction. I acknowledged what she said without adding to it. I had learned, over the past 5 years, that silence often reveals more than conversation. And as she continued, the purpose of the evening became clearer. She began to speak about opportunities, about investments, about how families should support each other when it matters most. Eric nodded along, his agreement quiet but visible. The conversation shifted from admiration to need, from recognition to expectation. When the request finally came, it was framed as something reasonable. They needed financial support, a significant amount, presented as a temporary solution to a situation they described as complex but manageable. The number itself did not surprise me. What surprised me was how naturally they assumed I would agree. I asked questions, not to challenge, but to understand. Their answers were vague, incomplete, shaped to sound reassuring without offering clarity. The more they spoke, the more the structure of their situation revealed itself. There were debts they had not mentioned directly, decisions that had not worked out as planned, expenses that exceeded what they could sustain. I let them finish. Then I began to speak. I told them I understood more than they thought, that I had taken the time to learn about their situation, to look beyond what they were choosing to share. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply laid out what I knew, piece by piece, allowing the weight of it to settle in the room. The change was immediate. Samantha's composure shifted, her confidence tightening into something defensive. Eric looked at me differently, as if seeing me for the first time in years. The balance that had existed at the start of the evening no longer held. I told them that money had not brought them to me. Not really. It had simply made them remember that I existed. The silence that followed was no longer polite. It was honest. The silence after my words did not break immediately. It settled into the room, heavy and unavoidable, pressing against every surface. No one moved at first. Samantha's expression remained composed, but I could see the tension gathering beneath it, small shifts in her posture that betrayed the loss of control she had not anticipated. Eric sat still, his gaze unfocused, as if he were trying to process something that had already moved beyond his ability to contain it. I did not speak again right away. I had learned that silence, when used correctly, reveals more than any argument. It forces people to sit with what they would rather avoid, and in that moment, there was nothing they could deflect, nothing they could reframe. Samantha was the first to respond. Her voice remained steady, but the precision in it had sharpened. She dismissed what I had said as assumption, as misunderstanding, as something built on incomplete information. She attempted to reestablish control by shifting the conversation back into familiar territory, suggesting that I was overstepping, that I was interpreting their situation in a way that was unfair. I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed, but because I no longer needed to react. When she finished, I clarified what I knew. I spoke about their financial situation in concrete terms, about the debts that had accumulated, about the investments that had not produced what they were meant to. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply described the structure of their reality as it existed beyond what they had chosen to share. Eric looked at Samantha then, not with certainty, but with hesitation. It was a subtle shift, but it was enough. Doubt had entered where trust had once been absolute. Samantha noticed it immediately. Her attention turned toward him for a brief moment, as if measuring how much of her control still remained. That was when I told them the rest. I explained that I had not only learned about their situation, but had acted within it. Through channels they would not have recognized, I had acquired a portion of their outstanding debt. It was not something I had done impulsively. It was a decision made carefully, with full awareness of what it would mean. In practical terms, it placed me in a position of influence over the financial structure they depended on. The reaction was immediate, though not loud. Samantha's composure faltered, just enough to reveal the calculation behind it. Eric's expression changed more visibly. The uncertainty that had been building now settled into something closer to realization. The situation was no longer abstract. It was tangible, and it involved me in a way neither of them had expected. I let that understanding settle before continuing. I told them there were two possible paths forward. The first involved transparency beyond this room, the kind that would extend into legal and financial consequences neither of them had prepared for. The second involved change, not in words, but in structure. It required separation from the decisions that had led them here, accountability for what had already been done, and a different approach to the future, particularly where their children were concerned. I did not frame it as a negotiation. There was nothing to negotiate. The choices were clear, and the responsibility for selecting between them did not belong to me. Samantha's response shifted again, moving from dismissal to something more emotional. She spoke about pressure, about expectations, about the complexity of maintaining the life they had built. The explanation was familiar, a reconfiguration of responsibility that placed circumstances at the center instead of decisions. It did not change anything. Eric remained quiet. His silence was different now. It was no longer avoidance. It was recognition, slow and incomplete, but present. He understood that the situation had moved beyond his control long before I entered it. I did not soften what I said next. I told them that the distance they had created 5 years ago had not been accidental. It had been a choice, one that removed me from their lives with intention. What was happening now was also a choice. The difference was that this time, they could not pretend it was anything else. The children remained in the room, quiet but attentive. They did not need explanations to understand that something had shifted. The atmosphere alone was enough. I stood after that, not to leave, but to mark the end of what I had to say. I told them they would have time to decide, not indefinitely, but enough to consider the reality of where they stood. I had not come to argue. I had come to end uncertainty. If you're still watching and you're ready to see the consequences of those choices unfold, comment number 6 below to stay with me. Now, let's move into Chapter 7, where everything begins to shift. I left the apartment without looking back. The elevator ride down felt longer than it should have, each second stretching as the weight of the evening settled into something solid and irreversible. Outside, the air was cool and steady, a quiet contrast to the tension I had just walked away from. For the first time in years, I did not feel uncertain. I felt grounded. The next morning came without urgency. I did not reach for my phone immediately. I did not replay the conversation in my mind the way I might have in the past. There was nothing left to analyze. Everything that needed to be said had already been placed clearly in front of them. What happened next was no longer within my control, and for once, that did not trouble me. Days passed before I heard from them. The silence felt different this time. It was not empty. It was active, shaped by decisions being made somewhere beyond my view. I imagined the conversations that must have taken place, the tension that would have filled their home, the weight of choices that could no longer be avoided. When the message finally came, it was brief. There were no explanations, no attempts to reshape what had already happened. It was an acknowledgement, a quiet acceptance of the conditions I had set. I read it once and set the phone aside. I did not feel satisfaction. I felt resolution. In the days that followed, the consequences unfolded quickly. The structure of their life, built on appearances and fragile decisions, began to shift under pressure. Legal processes were set in motion, financial realities examined more closely than they had ever been before. What had once been hidden behind confidence and presentation was now exposed to scrutiny. Eric struggled the most. The realization of how far things had gone, how much had been ignored, settled heavily on him. It was not something that could be undone with a single decision. It required a slow confrontation with the choices he had made and the distance he had allowed to grow. He began to withdraw, not in avoidance, but in reflection. Samantha reacted differently. The control she had maintained for so long began to slip, and with it, the certainty that had defined her presence. She tried to reframe the situation, to maintain a sense of direction, but the structure around her no longer supported it. Without that foundation, her influence diminished. The children sensed the change before they could fully understand it. They moved more quietly, watching, listening, adjusting to an environment that no longer felt stable. Their confusion was not expressed in words, but in small shifts, in the way they observed rather than engaged. I thought about them often during that time. They had been placed in the middle of something they did not create, shaped by decisions made long before they had the ability to question them. Whatever came next would need to consider them first. What had existed before was no longer sustainable. That much was clear. Something new was beginning, whether any of us were ready for it or not. When Eric and the children arrived in Sedona, the air felt different from the night I had left Charlotte. There was no tension sharp enough to cut through the room, but there was something else instead, something quieter and more uncertain. This was not a reunion. It was a beginning that none of us fully understood yet. I had prepared the house in small, practical ways. I set up 2 bedrooms for the children, choosing simple colors, leaving space for them to make it their own. I stocked the kitchen, arranged the living room, and made sure everything felt stable, even if the people entering it did not. I did not prepare for celebration. I prepared for adjustment. When they walked in, there was hesitation in every movement. Eric looked older than I remembered, not in years, but in weight. The children stayed close to him at first, their eyes moving across the unfamiliar space, trying to understand where they were and what this meant. I greeted them calmly, without expectation, allowing the moment to settle on its own. The first few days were quiet. We moved around each other carefully, as if any sudden interaction might disturb something fragile. Conversations were brief, focused on practical things. Meals were shared without much discussion. I did not push for connection. I understood that trust, once broken, does not return simply because you ask it to. Instead, I focused on consistency. I cooked at the same time each day. I kept the house steady, predictable. I allowed space for them to observe, to adjust, to feel without being forced to respond. Slowly, small changes began to appear. Lucy was the first to shift. Her curiosity surfaced in quiet ways, small questions asked without pressure, moments where she lingered a little longer in the same room. She watched me as I worked, as I moved through the routines I had built for myself. There was caution in her, but also interest. Ethan was different. He stayed closer to Eric, his reactions more guarded. There were moments when he seemed unsettled without being able to explain why. I did not try to reach him directly. I let him move at his own pace, knowing that forcing connection would only push him further away. I arranged for professional support early. Therapy was not something I considered optional. Each of them carried something that could not be resolved through time alone. The sessions were quiet at first, slow but necessary. Healing is not visible in the beginning. It takes shape beneath the surface before it ever shows. Eric changed in smaller ways. He spoke less, but listened more. He helped without being asked, moving through the house with a kind of quiet effort that had not been there before. It was not redemption, not yet, but it was movement. One afternoon, Lucy stayed in the kitchen while I was preparing a simple meal. She did not say much, but she did not leave either. That was enough. It was a beginning, small and almost invisible, but real. What we were building was not the family we had before. That version no longer existed. This one would have to be something new. If you're still watching and you want to see how this all truly ends, comment number 8 below, so I know you're still here. Now let's move into the final part of this story. Time did not erase what had happened, but it changed how it lived within us. Months passed in Sedona, and the house that once felt uncertain began to settle into a rhythm. It was not the same life I had before, and I no longer expected it to be. What we built instead was quieter, more deliberate, shaped by awareness rather than assumption. The retreat continued to grow, even as I stepped back from its daily demands. An offer came from a larger organization, one that wanted to acquire the space and expand its reach. The number they presented was significant, more than enough to secure a future not only for me, but for the children as well. I did not make the decision quickly. I walked through the property several times, remembering where it began, how uncertain it had once been, how much of myself I had placed into it. In the end, I chose to sell a portion of it, not because I needed to prove anything, but because I no longer needed to hold on to everything I had built. The value of it had already done its work. It had given me independence, and now it could provide stability for those who came after me. I structured the finances carefully. A trust was established for Lucy and Ethan, designed to support their education and future without exposing them to the mistakes that had shaped the past. Eric received support as well, but with clear boundaries. Stability, I had learned, does not come from giving freely without direction. It comes from understanding what is necessary and what is not. Life within the house became more natural over time. The conversations grew easier, though never careless. There was an understanding between us that had not existed before, built on honesty rather than expectation. Eric worked steadily, taking responsibility in ways that felt real, not performed. He did not try to repair everything at once. He focused on what could be done now. Lucy found her place quickly. She moved through the house with a confidence that had been absent when she first arrived. Ethan followed more slowly, but his presence became lighter, less guarded. The distance between us shortened in ways that did not need to be spoken. There were evenings when we sat together without tension, sharing space in a way that felt simple and complete. Not perfect, but enough. I understood then that what I had regained was not what I had lost. It was something different, something I chose. There are evenings now when the house is quiet in a way that no longer feels empty. The silence is no longer something that presses against me. It rests beside me, steady and familiar, like something I have learned to understand rather than fear. I sit on the back porch in Sedona, watching the light fade slowly across the red rocks, and I think about the life I once believed I had lost. What happened to me did not happen all at once. It unfolded slowly through small choices, quiet exclusions, and words that carried more weight than they seemed to. I was not pushed out of my family in a single moment. I was removed over time, until one day there was nothing left to hold on to. For a long time, I believed that meant I had lost everything. I was wrong. Family, I have learned, is not defined by blood alone. It is shaped by presence, by respect, by the willingness to remain when things are not convenient. Love without respect is not love that can sustain anything real. It becomes something conditional, something that can be withdrawn without warning. I spent years believing that if I waited long enough, things would return to what they were. But waiting does not restore what has been broken. It only delays the moment you decide to move forward. What I built in the years that followed did not replace what I lost. It created something different, something that belongs to me in a way nothing else ever has. I did not become stronger because I wanted to. I became stronger because there was no other option. Eric is still learning. So am I. What we have now is not perfect, but it is honest. The children are growing in ways that remind me that the future is not defined by the past, only influenced by it. They did not erase me. They revealed who I had to become. In the end, life does not always return what was taken, but it offers something just as valuable, the chance to rebuild with deeper understanding. Not every loss is meant to be reversed. Some are meant to awaken a strength that would have otherwise remained hidden. When everything familiar falls away, what remains is the truth of who we are without expectations, without dependence, without illusion. There is a quiet power in choosing to rise, not for revenge, not for validation, but for peace. To create a life that stands on self-worth rather than approval is the kind of freedom no one can take away. Healing is not about forgetting, but about no longer allowing the past to define the present. Thank you for being here and sharing this journey. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment and share your thoughts. Do not forget to follow and subscribe for more stories like this.